Okay, so before we get started, I do want to just ask you guys about the presentation topics that I emailed to you over the weekend. Does anybody have any thoughts on what they would like to do? Yes?
The women of Tolkien.
Okay, you want to take on women? Okay, great. Do you have an objection to that?
No.
Okay, then it's yours. And I think I offered you, like 3 or 4 choices?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Four
I'd
choices.
like to look back over them. Can I email you by
Yeah.
tomorrow?
Absolutely, yeah. You can, Ashlyn, you can have your choice of topic.
Okay, glad we didn't have to resort to fisticuffs.
You also did get your first choice of topic for the Brit Lit class because you volunteered to work by yourself, so.
That was the,
War in the Machine Age.
right, okay.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna get to that.
Yep. Okay, so let's just get back into the stuff then. Is there anything in particular that you guys want to talk about or that you want to focus on today?
I don't know if it's just me, but I think rhythmically,
Uh-huh.
Tom Bombadil works really well in music.
Okay.
Just the syllables of it, Tom Bombadil. I could,
Yeah.
that works really
Uh-huh.
well for like, how does he do it? It was,
Uh-huh.
he said his name like twice in a line, and I thought that works really well. For the verse.
He says his own name kind of a lot. Refers to himself in the Tom Bomb Jelly Tom Bombadillo.
You know, like the character of Tom Bombadil reminds me of, it's in the Hobbit. It's I can't remember. He's another wizard. It's something the Brown.
Okay, Radagast, who's in
Yeah.
the movie, but who was not
Right.
in the.
Like the
who's not in the
description of
book,
Tom
yeah.
Bombadil
Mhm.
and how he is
Yeah.
the master of the water, the woods, the water, and the meadows.
Uh-huh.
But he's not the master of,
Yeah.
like, how he interacts with nature reminds me of Radagast.
Yeah, or at least Peter Jackson's conception of Radagast. Right? Radagast is a character who appears in The Lord of the Rings in the second half of the Fellowship of the Ring, very, very briefly as a walk-on, right? But he's not a character whom Tolkien really fleshes out all that much, right? Now, Tom Bombadil, on the other hand, really only appears in the narrative in these couple of chapters, right? You know, he appears in these 3 chapters as the hobbits are moving out of the safety of the pastoral shire into the more dangerous lands around, right? And I think I want to focus for a second on that idea of Bombadil as master, right? Master of what? Because, yeah, you said, Ashlyn, that he is the master and he isn't.
Well, like, when Merry and Pippin are kidnapped by Old Man Willow, and
Uh-huh.
Frodo and Sam are like, let's light it on fire, and Bombadil's like, no, and he sings to the Old Man Willow, and Old Man Willow lets him go. It's like,
Uh-huh.
and then like when they encounter the White,
Uh-huh.
Tom Bombadil tells them sing this song
Yeah.
for protection. So it's like he's not the master of that area,
Uh-huh.
but he's the master of the knowledge of how to deal with that area.
Okay, yeah. So mastery in this case is knowing the right words, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, everything he does, he seems to affect through language and song, right? Now, there's a bit I actually find really kind of interesting regarding this character when they're in the house of Tom Bombadil and they're asking Goldberry questions about Tom, like who is he, right? Frodo says, "Fair lady," said Frodo again after a while, "tell me if my asking does not seem foolish. Who is Tom Bombadil?" "He is," said Goldberry, staying her swift movements and smiling. And I think he is and who is have ambiguous meanings, right?
Yeah.
What can who is Tom Bombadil mean?
Like, who is he? Like,
That's identity.
Yeah.
what is his identity?
Yeah. which can cut in two ways. Like, for example, which person is Tom Bombadil, right? But also,
What type of person?
yeah, what kind of person are we dealing with? And Goldberry's response, he is, seems to refer more to this version of for this idea of the question, right? That person singing in the kitchen is Tom Bombadil. But then she goes on to also answer the second version of the question, right? Frodo looked at her questioningly. "He is as you have seen him," she said in answer to his look. "He is the master of wood, water, and hill." "Then all this strange land belongs to him." "No, indeed," she answered, and her smile faded. "That would indeed be a burden," she added in a low voice as if to herself. "The trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master." So, none of the things in the forest belong to him, right? They belong to themselves. Conversely, what does that then mean about Tom?
He is himself.
He is himself.
Yeah, he is himself and doesn't belong to anyone or anything either, right? So I think we can think about this, where like, it might help us if we think about like what happens when he first encounters the ring, right? What happens when Frodo puts on the ring in front of Bombadil?
He disappears.
Does he disappear to Bombadil?
No.
Bombadil can still see him, right?
Yeah, like as he's trying to walk out the door, Bombadil's like, "Come back."
Yeah.
And then like when Bombadil he puts it on his pinky.
Yeah.
And he just giggles
Uh-huh.
at it and takes it back and like does tricks with it, and then he gives it back to Frodo.
Yeah. When he puts it on, nothing happens, right? So, what does the ring ultimately represent? And you know, I get that this is a bigger question that we probably can't really answer sufficiently.
Which Lord's power?
Yeah, it's
Essentially.
yeah, essentially, yeah. It's Sauron's power, right?
The one ring to rule them all.
Yeah. But I think that the essence of it, the essence of the symbol is contained in that line, right? One ring to do what?
One ring to rule them all.
To rule, right?
The ring of power.
Yeah. And the power it confers ultimately is mastery over the wills of others, right? In fact, when whenever Frodo puts the ring on, he puts the ring on kind of a lot
Yeah.
as he's trying to escape from the Shire, right? Does it ever seem like it's really his idea?
No.
Yeah, the ring compels him in various ways, right? Put me on, put me on.
It's like, earlier in the book when Gandalf is describing the history of the ring and how it's transitioned owners.
Yeah.
He doesn't say the owners willingly gave it up. It's like the ring
No.
made it. It's like, I don't want to be on your finger anymore. Goodbye.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, we can kind of, trace the ownership here, right, as Gandalf does, right? So it goes,
It's like the ring is its own entity,
Yeah.
in a way. Like it has its own, it has a consciousness in a way.
yeah, there's only one link in this chain, right, where the ring is given up willingly. And even that is challenging, right?
Yeah.
Bilbo is the only one whoever manages to simply leave the ring. Sauron has it cut from his finger. Isildur takes it, is killed by orcs and loses it in the swamp. Deagle finds it, is strangled to death by Smeagol to get it. Smeagol loses it in a cave, Bilbo finds it, and then Bilbo leaves it for Frodo, right? So yeah, there's only been one willing handoff in all of this, in this entire chain of transmission.
Well, and even in that handoff,
Mhm.
it took Gandalf almost threatening bodily harm
Yeah,
for Bilbo to leave it. And
Uh-huh.
Bilbo even still tried to trick Gandalf as he was walking out the door.
sure.
And Gandalf's like, "You still have it in your pocket?" He's like, "Oh, well, so I do."
Yeah, it's apparently not easy for anyone to give up. Like, not easy, like nearly impossible for anyone to give up, right? I mean, we learn, in chapter 2 that Smeagol is still chasing this ring across the world. It's been how many years now since he lost it, and he still can't get free of it, right? And then Bombadil just puts it on his finger and laughs. Doesn't disappear. Nothing happens, right? So then if we think about the ring as something that both represents the kind of will to rule others and something that rules over you, right? What does that then tell us about Bombadil? Why doesn't the ring work on Bombadil?
Master of himself, but master of none.
Yeah,
Well, also Bombadil's ancient. He's older
Sure.
than Sauron and his rings.
well, older than the rings,
All of the
yes.
rings. He says he tells the Hobbit stories, and
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of understood he remembers a time before the rings and Sauron and all that business.
Sure. But I think we also have to remember that Sauron is himself an ancient being, right? Who, at least in Tolkien's mythology, was Morgoth's lieutenant in the First Age, before Morgoth was defeated, right? And then he becomes the big bad when Morgoth is taken away and chased. So Sauron is himself a being that dates from the beginning of time, even though he wasn't then as he is now, right?
He's the Witch King, right?
The Witch King is actually the leader of the ring wraiths.
Okay.
But yeah, let's look at that whole history that Bombadil shows to the hobbits as they look out upon the forest with him. Right? He told them many remarkable stories, sometimes half as if speaking to himself, sometimes looking at them suddenly with a bright blue eye under his deep brows. Often his voice would turn to song, and he would get out of his chair and dance about. That would be particularly annoying if someone was trying to tell you a story, right? He told them tales of bees and flowers, the ways of trees, and the strange creatures of the forest, about the evil things and good things, things friendly and things unfriendly, cruel things and kind things, and secrets hidden under their brambles. As they listened, they began to understand the lives of the forest apart from themselves. Indeed, to feel themselves as the strangers where all other things were at home. Moving constantly in and out of his talk was Old Man Willow, and Frodo learned enough now to content him, indeed more than enough, for it was not comfortable lore. Tom's words laid bare the hearts of trees and their thoughts, which were often dark and strange, and filled with the hatred of things that go free upon the earth, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning. Destroyers and usurpers. It was not called the Old Forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods, and in it there lived yet, aging no quicker than the hills, the fathers of trees, remembering times when they were lords. The countless years had filled them with pride and rooted wisdom, and with malice. But none were more dangerous than the great willow. His heart was rotten, but his strength was green, and he was cunning and a master of winds, and his song and thought ran through the woods on both sides of the river. His gray, thirsty spirit drew power out of the earth and spread like fine root threads in the ground and invisible twig fingers in the air. till it had under its dominion nearly all the trees of the forest from the hedge to the downs. So, what is Tom giving to the hobbits in his storytelling here? What is he reframing for them? Or how is he making them look at things differently? What's uncomfortable for Frodo here? Essentially, what is he asking Frodo and the hobbits to do in talking about the trees?
Don't go chopping and burning them.
And how is he accomplishing that?
By giving them personalities, by making them human.
Yeah, and by providing by telling them what things look like from a tree's perspective, right? Yeah, the trees are rooted to the ground, right? And they see you and other things that go on two legs, wandering through the earth, right? As unappreciative of the place where you are, and as destroyers who just take and take and take from them, right? Who have reduced their ancient woods, where they were lords, to this tiny little patch between two of your villages, right? So yeah, what he's providing here is what the world looks like from a tree's perspective. So yeah, he does anthropomorphize the trees, which we'll see done kind of more directly in the Ents and the Two Towers. Yeah. But he's demonstrating that trees are something that can actually have a perspective, right? Now, let's compare this to the Hobbit's description of the bonfire glade. And, what happened when the trees, quote unquote, invaded the Shire. Right, so Merry, in describing the Old Forest and why he thinks it's safe to go through it, is stating that he doesn't believe Fatty Bulger's stories about goblins and wolves and things of that sort. I should say no. At any rate, I don't believe them. But the forest is queer. Everything in it is very much more alive, more aware of what is going on, so to speak, than things are in the Shire. And the trees do not like strangers. They watch you. They are usually content merely to watch you as long as daylight lasts and don't do much. Occasionally, the most unfriendly ones may drop a branch or stick a root out or grasp at you with a long trailer. But at night, things can be most alarming, or so I am told. I have only once or twice been in here after dark, and then only near the hedge. I thought all the trees were whispering to each other, passing news and plots along in an unintelligible language, and the branches swayed and groped without any wind. They do say the trees do actually move, and can surround strangers and hem them in. In fact, long ago they attacked the hedge. They came and planted themselves right by it and leaned over it. But the hobbits came and cut down hundreds of trees and made a great bonfire in the forest, and burned all the ground in the long strip east of the hedge. After that the trees gave up the attack, but they became very unfriendly. There is still a wide bare space not far inside where the bonfire was made. So, this is the hobbit's perspective of how the trees in the Old Forest behave, right? They're unfriendly. They drop things in the path. They try to hem us in when we're in there, right? And one time they tried to attack the hedge. The trees, what did the hobbits then do in response to this attack?
Cut them down and set them on fire.
Exactly, yeah, cut and burn, right? So, from the perspective of the trees, right, the hobbits are strangers, invaders, and murderers. And that's the thing that the initial Hobbit-centric view of nature here doesn't really seem to grasp, right? And I think that this actually kind of tells us something important about how the text, at least initially, kind of deals with hobbits and with their perspective. I think there's an interesting bit of parallelism at the beginning of the first two chapters, right? We have, at the beginning of A Long Expected Party, right, before we have actually met any of the Bagginses, we have this conversation, right, at the ivy bush between old Gaffer Gamgee and his cronies, right? And what is their conversation mostly concerned with? What are they talking about at the bar, at the Hobbit bar? I feel like
They're talking about Bilbo,
they're talking about Bilbo. Yeah, they're talking about how weird the Bagginses are, right?
particularly Bilbo and Frodo.
Particularly Bilbo and Frodo, right?
Yeah.
And they bring up this old rumor about how Frodo's parents died, right?
They drowned.
That they drowned, right? And there are all these stories surrounding it, right? I've heard that they went on the water after dinner in the moonlight, said old Noakes, and it was Drogo's weight that sunk the boat. And I heard she pushed him in, and he pulled her in after him, said Sandyman the Hobbiton Miller. So what we have here is like a lot of gossip about the eccentricities of the Bagginses, right? Which is particularly interesting considering what the name Baggins meant at the beginning of The Hobbit, right? We're told at the beginning of The Hobbit that you could reliably predict what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. Right? They're respectable, they're rich, they're predictable. And here they're surrounded by all kinds of weird, dark rumors, right? They're eccentric. And they also keep circling back to the idea of Bilbo's inexhaustible wealth, right?
There's also, especially in the first two chapters, and it mentions in Prologue, Hobbit's obsession with family trees.
Yeah.
Like they go through the means of saying, you know, right here they say, you see, Mr. Drago, he married poor Miss Primula Brandybuck. She was our Mr. Bilbo's first cousin on the mother's side, her mother being the youngest of Oldtook's daughter, and Mr. Drago was his second cousin. So Mr. Frodo is his first and second cousin once removed either way. There's like an obsession with genealogy.
Yeah, with genealogy, with family. And this isn't even their own family they're talking about, right? This is another family. I think it's also relevant here what we're told the hobbits like in their books, right?
Mm-hmm. They don't want any nonsense. They want a clear-cut story.
They like to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions, right? And yet at the same time, like, the stories that they're telling in the bar are full of contradictions, right? We're told at least 3 different versions of the drowning of Drogo Baggins and Primula Brandybuck, right? And this of how young Frodo came to live with Uncle Bilbo, or Cousin Bilbo, more accurately, right? And I think the thing to note about this first barroom scene, this first barroom conversation, is that the gaffer is the one who tries to put an end to the nonsense speculation, right? So while he initiates the storytelling, he also tries to put down the various alternate versions of things that other people come up with, right?
Even his own son. Because Sam mentions, he's like, I swear I've seen an elm tree move.
Yeah, but Sam's not in this scene, right?
No.
Sam's in the second bar scene, which almost exactly parallels this one. So the other scene takes place at the beginning of chapter 2 at the Green Dragon in Bywater. So we can see that apparently the Ivy Bush is the old man Hobbit bar, right? And the green dragon is where the younger hobbits hang out, right? In fact, we have like a clear generational divide here, not only in that this is where Sam Gamgee hangs out, right, son of Gaffer Gamgee, but also Ted Sandyman, the son of the miller who argues with the gaffer in the first scene, is here as well, right? So one thing I think is interesting to note here, particularly the opposition between these figures, is that the Gamgees are gardeners. And the Sandymans are millers. And I think that both of these professions indicate different attitudes towards nature and towards consumption and growth, right? What does a gardener do, essentially?
Nurture.
Yeah. Nurtures, right? Plants things in the ground to help them grow, right? What does a miller do?
Turn those things into
Meal.
meal.
Yeah. Uses a machine, whether complex or simple, to grind things into meal, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, a gardener is a nurturer, and a miller is at least arguably a destroyer, even though he's ultimately destroying things to nurture, right? Because the meal is going to be baked into bread. But the miller also works with machines. And so I think having the miller be the skeptic in both of these conversations, or having the miller be the antagonist rather than the skeptic, because when talking with the gaffer, the miller is not the skeptic. The miller is the one spreading wild stories. But in this scene, it is the miller who's the skeptic, right? Ted Sandyman is the one who's casting doubt on Sam's stories of walking trees and shit. I think it foreshadows some of the attitudes towards machines and industry that we'll see in later parts of the novel. But why is it, or why might it, what does it tell us about hobbits that even in these two scenes that are apparently some time apart in different bars featuring different generations of hobbits, is there much difference between the two conversations?
No.
Yeah, so what this really does is give us a sense of the Shire as this kind of enclosed world where nothing much really changes, right?
Yeah, it's kind of boring.
Yeah.
It's stagnant to a certain degree.
Just like fairies.
Well, but they can create. Fairies can't create anything original. Hobbits
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, that's true, they can. And in fact, one of the things that makes Sam unusual, particularly for a hobbit of his class, right, is that he is imaginative and creative.
And obsessed with elves.
Yeah. He's fascinated by elves. And he's consistently surprising later on his traveling companions with things that he knows, or even like little songs or poems that he's composed, right? So for one thing, he knows how to read and write, which we know is not universal among working class hobbits. And he often displays an intelligence and insight beyond what the Ted Sandymans of the world show, right? But I think that that's like one of the things that's interesting about Sam, even in the Green Dragon conversation here, is that he seems to be the only person in the bar capable of imagining a world outside of the Shire. Even if he's never seen it and becomes profoundly uncomfortable once they move, beyond the limits of his geography, right? I think he says, it says that he knows the land really well within 20 miles of Hobbiton. And then once you get beyond that, he's at a loss.
Yeah.
But yeah, he is able to imagine other things and other, like, he's even, really kind of struck by the elves that they meet near Woodhall.
Poor Sam. Well, it's like, Sam, like Frodo wants to treat Sam as a friend, but he still puts him in that servant role.
Yeah.
When they go to leave, he's like, Sam, my pack is too heavy. And Mary's like, ignore him, Sam, it'll be good for him. But then later on, after their first night, he's like, Sam, is the bath water ready? Get it, come on, get breakfast on, get the hot water going.
And
it's like,
and there is this, and Sam doesn't speak the way the others do either, right?
he calls hobbits his own age, sir.
Yeah. Well, the creative origin of Sam Gamgee is a World War I figure known as a Batman. Not that Batman.
I know,
no.
I'm sorry.
But a Batman was a kind of personal valet to an officer. And Tolkien remembered, Sam is built in large part out of Tolkien's memories of the Batman of various officers that he knew. The other potential creative origin here is a figure out of university culture known as a scout. And I don't believe this particular institution exists anymore, but essentially like young gentlemen who went up to Oxford or to Cambridge for their university education were given a kind of personal servant known as a scout, whose job was to, well, for one thing, get them acclimated to to their new surroundings, hence scout, right? But also kind of like to do small things for them. So, yeah, Sam's creative origins kind of lie in these figures here. But I think, what I meant there in terms of the way he talks, right? Sam speaks in a kind of rustic dialect, and the three aristocratic hobbits he's traveling with don't, right?
Like Frodo would say, let's go, Sam. Sam would probably be like, come on, and C, comp, M-O-N. Come on, Frodo.
Well, he would never tell the others when it's time to go, right?
Yeah, but I was just trying to compare how many his dialect would be.
Yeah. And yeah, he drops H's and things like that, right? It's clearly, he speaks in a way that appears kind of less refined and less educated. So, what do you make of the fact that Frodo leaves the Shire, sets off on his journey with only other hobbits as his companions, right? If we compare this to the way Bilbo set off, on the one hand, Bilbo had no time to prepare, right?
Didn't have time to grab a travel handkerchief.
Yep, no handkerchief, no hood,
Not even a walking
no walking stick.
Frodo had the whole summer.
Yeah.
And part of September.
Yeah, and he leaves he does his best to leave secretly, right? So Frodo's departure is planned out. Bilbo's was not. The dwarves show up one night, and then the next morning he's off on the road with them. But Bilbo also had a wizard and 13 dwarves with him, right? To prop him up until he was ready for proper heroics. But the very nature of Frodo's leaving the Shire is different because he lacks that specific guide, right? Do we really see Frodo meeting any challenges head on in this first half of the book? Yeah, in fact, most of it seems to be being chased, right? Right, he's running from the Black Riders. right, the nature of which is still unknown. He is hemmed in by the trees in the old forest. He's captured by a barrow wight and has to be rescued. And then he's stabbed by a black rider on Weathertop, right?
Mhm.
So on the whole, Frodo's adventures are, at least in terms of his own doings, markedly unsuccessful, right? And in much more dire and serious ways than Bilbo's were, in part because the people who can get Frodo out of trouble aren't always close at hand, right? Gandalf isn't popping up to fix things here. He can summon Tom Bombadil to help with the Barrow Wight and with the trees, right? Strider can make a little poultice that'll help ease the pain of his wound, but can't cure him. And none of them have the power to resist the Black Riders for long, right? Not to mention that many of Frodo's problems are caused by the ring acting upon him, right? So Frodo is overall a pretty powerless and passive hero, right? Who's being pushed by events rather than pushing events himself, right? Now, I want to look for a second here. This might be a slight digression here, but I want to look for a second at what happens in the Barrow Wight episode. Both the description of the danger and what it takes to get rid of the wight itself. So, I don't know what page it is in yours because I'm not sure we have the same page numbers. It would be in the middle of Fog on the Barrow Downs. It's page 137 in my edition.
Is it right here where, the dark chamber echoed as if to a drum and trumpet, ho, Tom Bombadil, Tom Bombadilio.
Okay, it would be slightly before that. Right, so he's been wandering through this valley with the cold stone, the cold standing stone, right? They did the thing Tom Bombadil told them not to, and they walked on the east side of the road rather than the west. When he came to himself again, for a moment he could recall nothing except a sense of dread. Then suddenly he knew that he was imprisoned, caught hopelessly. He was in a barrow. A Barrow Wight had taken him, and he was probably already under the dreadful spells of the Barrow Wights about which whispered tales spoke. He dared not move, but lay as he found himself, flat on his back upon a cold stone with his hands on his breast. But though his fear was so great that it seemed to be part of the very darkness that was round him, he found himself as he lay thinking about Bilbo Baggins and his stories, of their jogging along together in the lanes of the Shire and talking about roads and adventures. There is a seed of courage hidden, often deeply it is true, in the heart of the fattest and most timid hobbit, waiting for some final and desperate danger to make it grow. Frodo was neither very fat nor very timid. Indeed, though he did not know it, Bilbo and Gandalf had thought him the best hobbit in the Shire. He thought he had come to the end of his adventure, and a terrible end, but the thought hardened him. He found himself stiffening as if for a final spring. He no longer felt limp like a helpless prey. As he lay there, thinking and getting a hold of himself, he noticed all at once that the darkness was slowly giving way. A pale greenish light was growing round him. It did not at first show him what kind of a place he was in, for the light seemed to be coming out of himself, and from the floor beside him, and had not yet reached the roof or wall. He turned, and there in the cold glow he saw lying beside him Sam, Pippin, and Merry. They were on their backs, and their faces looked deathly pale, and they were clad in white. About them lay many treasures, of gold maybe, though in that light they looked cold and unlovely. On their heads were circlets, gold chains were about their waists, and on their fingers were many rings. Swords lay by their sides, and shields were at their feet. But across their 3 necks lay one long naked sword. So on the one hand, we actually have Frodo here finding his courage to do something, right? When they were attacked by the willow, what did he do?
Panicked.
He panicked and ran around shouting for help, right? Here, he feels himself stiffening as if for a final spring, right? He no longer felt limp like a helpless prey. So there seems to be some development here. Now, when he comes to, what do you make of what he sees? What's in the chamber with him?
There's this light.
Yep, there's the pale greenish light.
I mean, Sam, Pippin, and Merry are there, but there's also treasure
Yeah.
all around it. It's like, it's a grave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks very much like an old ship burial or something like that, right? These old, what's inside a lot of these old barrows that you still find in various places in rural England, right? You still sometimes have a farmer plowing his field, like digging up all of these old Viking or Anglo-Saxon grave goods, right? He's like, well, what the hell is this? And the barrow-white figures are similar to those Old Norse Draugr, which I believe we talked about when we discussed Beowulf.
Mm-hmm.
So do we remember what Draugr were?
Ghouls.
Restless bodies.
Yeah, they're restless spirits, right? They're undead spirits. That are tied to a grave, right? They're tied to a barrow. And what ties them there is greed. Right, so they remain eternally vigilant to protect their grave goods from thieves, right? And so here we have a hole in the ground that's filled with treasure and haunted by a jealous spirit. Does this look in any way similar to anything that's been discussed earlier in the novel?
Look at the way, the way the other hobbits talk about Bilbo.
Yeah.
Saying how, we even have instances where Frodo is giving off the gifts Bilbo's left for people. He finds people looking for tunnels, and there's Old Man Baggins has tunnels in his hobbit hole filled with gold.
Yeah. This is almost like a hobbit hole filled with treasure, right? It's a hole in the ground that's filled with treasure.
Or a hall under a mountain.
Yeah.
Treasure protected.
Or a hall,
by
yeah, exactly. Or, yeah, like the Dwarf's Kingdom in the Lonely Mountain. Yeah, a hall under a mountain filled with treasure. But what do we remember about what Bilbo did with his treasure after he left?
He gave it away.
Yeah. He gave most of it away. Right? There are all of those labels that people find. Most of them are little, pointed jokes about, friends who,
The umbrella.
who don't ask to borrow umbrellas, or who
Never respond.
don't respond to letters, or who borrow books and never return them, right?
That's one was the spoons to Labella.
Yeah, because he suspected them of having stolen his silver spoons at the end of The Hobbit, right? So yeah, for Lobelia Sackville Baggins as a present, right? said they're
He's
silver
clever.
spoons, yeah.
I mean, it's funny, but also,
Mhm.
I mean, at the same time, it's kind of a jerk thing to do. Like with her, I understand, because
Sure.
they did try to rob his house.
Yeah,
But like, okay, your friend never asked to borrow the umbrella. You obviously can afford other umbrellas. Just like,
Sure.
let him have
Mhm.
one. And the book thing, I understand.
mm-hmm,
And maybe the friend who doesn't respond to letters, maybe they're too busy. You never know.
mm-hmm.
Not everybody can luxury the book.
Although, like, can we, in the world of upper middle to upper class hobbits, does it ever seem like anyone's really all that busy? Yeah, unless they're going off on adventures, no, right? And most hobbits don't go off on adventures. The big point that I want to make, or the thing I really want to draw attention to, is the giving away of things, right? Just as Bilbo is the only person to have ever given away the ring. What's the only way, according to Tom Bombadil, that the whites can actually be dispelled from the graves?
Spread their treasure out.
Exactly. You gotta break open the barrow and spread the treasure around, right? So hoarding is what creates these nasty undead spirits, right? And I think that there is a connection here with certain hobbity tendencies. And also with the dwarvish gold curse that we alluded to a moment ago, right? That the whole, there is kind of larger kind of theme or discourse of renunciation. As the way to defeat evil. I mean, the whole point of Frodo's quest, right, is not to find something, but to get rid of something. To destroy something that's evil, rather than to find something that's good. And so I think that there's an analog of that in the episode with the Barrow Wight. Now, I want to tie this, if we can, to what happens to Frodo on Weathertop. So this is one of the incidents in which he feels compelled to put on the ring, right? So let's trace those for a second, and then focus on this one specifically because it seems to be the biggie. So when's the first time he feels compelled to put on the ring?
Black Riders when they try to, when they have to hide under that tree.
Yeah. Yeah, the first time he's still in the Shire. Hiding from the Black Riders. And doesn't know what they are yet or why he wants to hide from them, but as he's hiding, he feels a compulsion to put the ring on his finger. Though this time he manages to resist. What's the second time he feels compelled to put the ring on his finger?
When the trees are hemming in, is it?
There's one before that.
Well, when the trees are hemming him in, he falls asleep, right?
Yeah.
When the willow attacks, that doesn't seem to spark anything, right? And it's interesting too that he never feels compelled to put on the ring in the barrow either, right? Even though there's clearly an evil presence there. The next time he feels compelled to put on the ring, right? He played this little test in Bombadil's house. The next time he feels compelled to do it is in the Prancing Pony, right? When he sings his song, falls off the table, and the ring just ends up on his finger somehow, right?
He plays it off like, oh, when I fell, I rolled.
Yeah. And then the third time is on Weathertop.
And he can see the Black Rider's face.
Yes. Yeah, he enters their world, right? But what do all three of these events have in common?
The Black Riders.
Yeah, the Black Riders are nearby, right? Or they're agents. Now, if we look at the other dangers he faces, the Willow and the Barrow-wight, in which he doesn't put the ring on or feel compelled to do so, what does that tell us about those particular dangers as opposed to this one?
They weren't by Sauron.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the Black Riders are Sauron's creatures.
exactly. Yeah. He only feels the compulsion in the presence of an evil that is actively in league with Sauron, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. The Barrow-wights seem to be kind of their own thing. Old Man Willow is only evil as a matter of perspective, right? He's a tree. He's a natural object, not a although a sentient tree, apparently.
He's not inherently evil.
He is a part of nature that is hostile, but is not necessarily evil, right? Or at least that is hostile to hobbits. And one thing that's going on here, I think, is that if we trace back the origins of these characters in this text, the creative origins of much of what's happening in the first half of the Fellowship, like basically the stuff that happens before they get to Bree, is coming from a different place than the Sauron and Black Riders and Ring stuff. So, at the time, roughly, that Tolkien was composing what will become The Hobbit, he was also writing a series of kind of these fantasy nonsense poems that he started, I think the earliest dates from about 1924. And they're not directly related to the Silmarillion material he was working on at the same time. So one of the poems that he writes at this time is called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And in that poem, Bombadil is a kind of trickster hero who wanders through a forest and has a series of adventures in which he's opposed by the Willow Man and by the Barrow-wight who lives in the old graves, and by the River Withawindle itself, from whom he wins his wife Goldberry. The character itself, the character Bombadil himself, is based physically on a wooden Dutch doll that belonged to Tolkien's second son, Michael. So he has his origin in children's play and in a toy. And also, to an extent, it's been argued, a Finnish demigod called Vainamoinen, who is depicted as a bearded man who sings songs of power in the language before there was language. But yeah, originally the Tom Bombadil stuff isn't related to any of the Middle-earth stuff or the Silmarillion stuff. It's an independent project that, as Tolkien is trying to come up with a sequel for The Hobbit, gets incorporated with all of this other stuff that he's been working on since just after the Great War. And I think that's part of the reason why the villains in this part of the narrative are unconnected directly to Sauron. And indeed, even maybe part of the explanation as to why Sauron's ring has no power over Tom, right? Because he comes from someplace else.
I like that it also never says what Tom Bombadil is.
Mm-hmm.
You don't understand if he's human, he's elf, hobbit,
Uh-huh.
dwarf. He
Yeah.
just is.
Yeah. He doesn't look like any of those things really, yeah.
We also understand that he's ancient.
Yeah. And in fact, yeah, he does actually predate, in Tolkien's imagination, any of the characters in The Lord of the Rings, with the possible exception of Sauron, right? You know, we know, yeah, he's writing poems about Tom Bombadil as early as 1934. Although I don't think the Bombadil poem gets published until the early 60s. Right? A lot of Tolkien's work is like that. It's stuff that kind of sits in his files for years and then, you know, is published later on when he no longer feels embarrassed by being an Oxford Don who writes little fantasy stories. But yeah, the only dangers that prompt Frodo to put on the ring are those that are directly connected to Sauron. Now let's look at what he sees on Weathertop when he puts in the ring. So right at the end of the chapter, over the lip of the little dell, on the side away from the hill, they felt rather than saw a shadow rise, one shadow or more than one. They strained their eyes, and the shadows seemed to grow. Soon there could be no doubt. 3 or 4 tall black figures were standing there on the slope, looking down on them. So black were they that they seemed like black holes in the deep shade behind them. Frodo thought that he heard a faint hiss as of venomous breath, and felt a thin, piercing chill. Then the shapes slowly advanced. So, what do we make of the physical description in our world of these things? What do we notice about them?
They're like shadows.
Shadows, yeah. And what is a shadow?
I mean, it's a copy
Mm-hmm.
of somebody.
Yeah. What does a shadow require?
Like,
Yeah. Because a shadow itself really is the absence of light, right? Created by a shape. Now, what's weird about seeing shadows in their particular situation? Should they be able to see shadows when and where they are? Yeah, you don't usually see shadows in the dark, right? So here we have these impressions made upon the darkness coming towards them, right? What does that indicate to us about the nature of the riders? What are we supposed to think about the nature of the riders if there's shadows that you can still see in the dark?
I mean, they have a form. They're not completely shapeless.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like let's say you're laying in your room and
Uh-huh.
you shut the door, the lights are off. You can still see like the outline of your dresser.
Sure.
And maybe your closet door.
Yeah, because light's not totally absent, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very rare that we ever find ourselves in absolute darkness. But in this case, I think what's happening is that the shadows basically indicate that the fact that they're shadows indicates that they are more an absence than a presence, right? That they are not physical bodies in our world.
Well, you could also say they're shadows of the former kings they used to be too.
Yeah, and a shadow, in that sense, a shadow is a kind of pale imitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That these are guys who were powerful kings of men when they were alive, and now they're puppets of a superior will, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they are also weaker versions of what they used to be. Terror overcame Pippin and Merry, and they threw themselves flat on the ground. Sam shrank to Frodo's side. Frodo was hardly less terrified than his companions. He was quaking as if he was bitter cold, but his terror was swallowed up in a sudden temptation to put on the ring. The desire to do this laid hold of him, and he could think of nothing else. He did not forget the barrow nor the message of Gandalf, but something seemed to be compelling him to disregard all warnings, and he longed to yield. Not with the hope of escape or of doing anything, either good or bad. He simply felt that he must take the ring and put it on his finger. He could not speak. He felt Sam looking at him as if he knew that his master was in some great trouble, but he could not run towards him. He shut his eyes and struggled for a while, but resistance became unbearable, and at last he slowly drew out the chain and slipped the ring on the forefinger of his left hand. And here we discover why they want him to put on the ring, right? This brings him into their world. Immediately, though everything else remained as before, dim and dark, the shapes became terribly clear. He was able to see beneath their black wrappings. There were 5 tall figures, 2 standing on the lip of the dell, 3 advancing. In their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long gray robes. Upon their gray hairs were helms of silver, and in their haggard hands were swords of steel. Their eyes fell on him and pierced him as they rushed towards him. Desperate, he drew his own sword, and it seemed to him that it flickered red as if it was a firebrand. 2 of the figures halted. The third was taller than the others. His hair was long and gleaming, and on his helm was a crown. In one hand he held a long sword, and in the other a knife. Both the knife and the hand that held it glowed with a pale light. He sprang forward and bore down on Frodo. So what do they look like in this other world?
Pale imitations of what they used to be, of the men
Yeah.
they used to be. They look like ghosts.
Pale, haggard. I would also suggest, and since we're running out of time because we started early, we'll end here. I would also suggest that the fact that they inhabit a world parallel to ours, and that they are tall, thin, pale beings with long hair and lots of silver around them, they're not entirely unlike fairies and elves of European folklore, right? Particularly if we think back to something like Sir Orfeo, right? Where the fairies can sort of, they appear out of nowhere and can only appear to people at certain liminal spots, right?
What do you say about moment of possible death is a very good liminal spot.
Yes, it is indeed. But yeah, Frodo has the gateway, right, in the ring that lets him come in and out of that particular world. And then the wound renders him liminal until the tip of the knife can be extracted, right? You know, he is halfway between those two worlds for the next chapter. Right? Not yet in the Wraith world, but working his way towards it. And then has to cross another liminal thing, the ford of a river, right, in order to be cured. All right, so that is all the time we have. We'll pick this up with the second half, which we will find is notably different in tone. On Monday. And let me just give you the guide questions.
Once we both have what we want to do for presentations, will we get instructions on how to go about?
Yes, you will.
Okay, because the women are talking, because they're not in his stories, you don't
Uh-huh.
really have women mentioned, but when they are mentioned, they kind of all look and sound similar.
Sure.
To a
And
certain
yeah,
extent.
I will give you both instructions for doing the presentation and some suggested sources.